just getting into the characters' heads in different ways is so interesting. And I never expected how much they would come alive on the page. And so that's definitely fascinating to me, to see that happen. And then the whole world building where, I mean, I am going through a series of prompts of like, describe what the coffee shop looks like, describe, that the clothes and the apartment and where they're going and all of those details. And I never realized like how important like character really deeply developing the character is. And it's interesting because I actually went to a romance book club, and uh it was in Columbia, Missouri, and it was so interesting to hear with the book that we read, there wasn't deep character development, but everybody at the book club wanted more character development. They felt like the character fell really flat,
Mhm.
and just didn't have any depth to her, and was kind of she was supposed to be college age, and everybody was like, she was a little bit too much of a deep thinker in some areas for being 20 years old.
Mhm.
So that was kind of interesting to learn about, like, from the reader perspective. And I can agree with that from like the reader perspective, which I always think sometimes as writers we don't always remember in the moment to think like, well, what are the readers wanting?
Mhm. It's interesting you talking about that because I feel like with memoir, you're a little bit like hands tied behind your back as far as like the other characters within your story because it's all in how like in your perception of them or like facts surrounding them. It's like you can't really touch like what they're thinking and feeling. It's just your perception of what they're thinking and feeling. So
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes they do come off as a little bit more two-dimensional, or certainly distilled down. Um, but I do think that people that read memoir understand that like that it's purely your own perspective and you're the only character in that book that's gonna have that level of like depth and dimension.
Well, and I think readers of memoir, that's why they're picking it up, is that they're wanting to connect with you. They're wanting to connect with, whoever wrote the memoir. And that's what they're hoping for, is thinking, well, maybe this story will help me understand myself. And so I think the the challenge with memoir is that focus on yourself at the same time, though. I mean, it, because the spotlight is on you and how you process things and how you think through things. And so that's also a lot to carry as a writer, is making sure that you're very clear in how you're sharing your experiences.
Well, and I found in like, critique situations where I've shared stuff that all the time I'm presented with questions about, well, what about this and what about that? Because there's just so much that I just assume because it's my life. I don't think about those things that I have to state. Um, because it's just built into my own natural framework that I don't think to like explain those things. And so that's one of those things that either critique groups or beta readers or whatever, like where that real value is in the editing process, showing you what, where those gaps are from a reader perspective, where
Mm-hmm.
those voids
Definitely.
are.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, especially, I mean, and I find this even with any writing that I do, is that when I'm too close to it, I don't see where I haven't explained something or given more detail or whatever it might be. Like, I just think like, oh, everybody just knows because I know, or whatever it might be. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely helpful when you have other people who can give you perspective.
Yeah, that was the value I saw in sort of taking that, 3, 4 month hiatus within the middle of my writing of the memoir was because I needed a little bit of distance from those stories, from me at that time versus me now. And that's one of the wild things about memoir too, is as you grow as a person, as you continue to live life and have, new experiences, those present day experiences can impact how you look back at past experiences. Um, and it can change your perspective to the point that I found I've had to rewrite some stories simply because my perspective has shifted. But at the same time, I also make a point to try to journal my present day feelings
Mhm.
so that I can capture some of that present day, like frustration, angst, excitement, whatever it is, before those feelings, 'cause feelings are transient. So before they start to change and morph and, gain, context or whatever, but those in the moment, like sensations, I try to capture those at least in my journal so that I can reference how I felt in this particular moment when this news, when I first heard this news versus once I sat down and processed it and sat with my feelings and talked to a therapist and XYZ, where I arrived at later. I mean, I think both of those pieces are really like valuable insight and really interesting to
Mhm.
read, but it's so hard to like capture both.
Well, and you bring up so many good things about like taking a break and then also just the power of journaling. I mean, especially,
Mhm.
and I think this is true even, I mean, for myself, that I know that journaling helps me get like the mess out of my head before I have to sit down and think about what I'm writing. And and certainly for you, I mean, it's so powerful with memoir writing to be able to capture where you were at that moment in time and be able to have
Mhm.
that to go back to, because I mean, life just passes us by so fast most days that sometimes you can't remember. I mean, I can't remember
Mhm.
maybe what I did yesterday afternoon or how I felt, or but to be able to, especially with significant life events, and really
Mhm.
process that through writing is so key. And definitely journaling is such a great practice.
Yeah, and I think that's what like readers of memoir really want to see anyways. They want to see the character like in the mess, grappling with things, not just like the aftershot of like, oh, this hard thing happened, but now I feel this about it. We want to see the journey. We want to see that process because when you're in the
Mhm.
thick of it, you're looking for any sort of validation that you're going to be able to make it through. And so I don't find it particularly helpful when I read memoir that's written from such a like distant perspective, and reflection back, if they aren't able to tap into like the heaviness of the moment or the
Well, yeah.
excitement, positive or negative, up or down.
Well, exactly. I mean, being able to really have the real human emotions. I think that, because I mean that's
Mhm.
what people are looking for. And I mean it's the same
Mhm.
thing I find even in writing romance, that people want to read like the real feelings of when people are in love or people get mad at each other, or they don't want the like whatever tension happens between the characters to just be glossed over as like, oh well, this was just a minor thing but now everything's happy. It's like, no, there are like real things that happen in relationships that need to be handled, and people want to see like, oh, like I can have a disagreement with someone I care about and it all comes out the other side. And I mean, I think the same, I mean, similarly, I mean, in memoir, people want you to go deep because that's what they're looking for, because they're reading it to either get to know you or to work through something that they feel they're connecting with you about, and something similar. So it's definitely
Yeah, I
interesting.
think the celebrity memoirists benefit from the whole like people are just curious and want to, understand their lives better. But I think for the rest of us who are just every day, people living our lives, it's really about finding that like universality in our struggles. And in the different like situations we've had to face and in the, all the different positive moments, like here's the feelings I had around having my daughter, and here's like the, euphoria of, post-birth early motherhood, but then here's the drudgery that suddenly appears in the, the day-to-day and the isolation and the, you know,
Mhm.
uncertainty of these moments and being able to show all of that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, motherhood is definitely one of those topics. I remember those days of drudgery all too well, being in the trenches. And I mean, and a lot of people need to feel that there's that common experience, because as a culture, everything is so glorified, like, oh, this is going to be the most wonderful time of your life. And really, for everyone, that's not everybody's experience. There are the realities of, women experiencing postpartum depression in significant ways, or just having regrets. And I mean, we need to be real about that and get those stories out there so people don't feel like, oh, it's supposed to all be like, you know, pretty tied with a pretty bow, and there's something wrong with you if everything isn't that way.
Yeah, there are times I've sought out those, you know, trying to look to see if I'm the only one who's felt this way or if that's more of a universal thing, like moving into a shared custody schedule and facing that like onslaught of grief of suddenly finding myself not being a full-time mom after being a
Hmm.
stay-at-home mom for the last 2 years. And like in this weird way, I felt like I was like grieving like the death of my child, and not to say that it's at all similar to what, you know, parents who actually lose a child feel, but I was just like, did anyone else feel like it was this heavy? Am I the only one who's like really like struggling with it to this degree? And I was like Googling, you know, to see like if anyone else who had experienced that, you know, felt that way, and how long did they feel that way? You know, how long can I
Hmm.
expect to like, you know, feel it to this degree? Does it get better? Does it ever like feel happy? Or do you this time just make it, you know, take the edge off? So hearing
Well,
those
no,
other
they're
stories is so helpful.
well, it is helpful. And I mean, I know, I mean, also being in a shared custody situation, that I mean, I feel like it's often unpredictable, and you have moments where you're enjoying the time you have, but then you're like, but wait a minute, I used to be doing these things, or I wish I was doing these things, or shouldn't I be doing these things? And then it can start to weigh on you. I know, like, I definitely have been there where, I struggle, and then it's the struggle of the co-parenting and figuring all of that out. So,
Yeah, it definitely took me by surprise because of what you're saying. Like initially I felt relief, you know, and finally getting some help with the parenting and having those breaks. And like, so I lived in that for a little while. So when all of a sudden like the pendulum swung the other way, like it, you know, it took me off guard for sure.
yeah, no, it is hard. Like, I know, I mean, I struggle. I mean, my boys are teenagers now, and I still find myself wanting to like control certain things or take charge of things, but then also knowing sometimes they're just things that are out of my control. And that's a hard thing. Like, there are definitely challenges with that. Um,
So going back to what you were saying with like trying to create like basically authentic struggles within the relationships that you're writing about within the romance genre, do you find that you like source those within like your own experience or those experiences of like friends or family members who have like confided in you in order to like make it more authentic versus like, you know, the movies we watch on Netflix and whatever else?
well, I mean, I definitely use a little bit of Netflix for some research. I mean, definitely there's an aspect of using some Netflix dramas, romance for some research, but it definitely comes from more of my own experience, and also sometimes even from like eavesdropping on conversations. And I mean, it's one of the reasons why I often like to leave the house and sit in coffee shops or other places to write, because sometimes you can get some really interesting conversations that are often surprising that people will just sit and like share their entire life or something, and you're like, I'm sitting right here next to you and you're sharing deep thoughts. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot that's pulled from different places. But yeah, it's definitely sort of a fun part of collecting things that people say and using those and trying to put those into the dialogue, especially
I
when
think one of my
especially when characters are arguing. Like,
I think one of my favorite places to eavesdrop, mainly because there's just so many different options, is the airport. I mean, you got
oh
people who
yes.
are like a lot of times in stressful situations, but you also have the people that are like going on a fun vacation. So you've got like all these different like stress levels and intensities. And there's always, I mean, there's so many people around that it's easy to like listen in to various conversations kind of incognito. But I could swear I hear the most interesting things like when I'm traveling through airports.
Oh, no, airports are great. And then also if you happen to be seated on a plane either in front of, usually it's better to hear when you're in front of people, but sometimes if you're behind, if it's a really loud talker. I mean, because I'm thinking about, so the last flight I was on when I was flying from Seattle to Denver, there was a woman sitting in front of me, and she shared very openly that she was like in her 60s, sitting next to a young man who shared with her that he was like still in college, so in his 20s, and that he was going to visit his girlfriend in Colorado that he hadn't seen in 9 months. And so then she was very loud. And she also ordered herself 2 glasses of wine on the plane. So that then of course like proceeded to make her louder. Um, but I kind of felt for the young guy because she was giving him a lot of advice about how he should be, all the things he should do and this and that, and then like, asking him a lot of questions about himself. And in a weird way, it was kind of like she was somewhat flirty with him. And I think that that's why he kept really mentioning his girlfriend because I think she was kind of creeping him out, especially because she had that thing that like some women do, and I notice it's more common with like women who are older. Just like think about like who like to like, because like my mother-in-law, like when she talks to me, if I'm sitting next to her, she'll like touch my arm the entire time she's talking to
Mhm.
me. And I mean, I'd probably lose skin if she actually rubbed on like so anyways, so like uh but yeah, it was just hilarious, this conversation, because I was thinking, wow, she's really loud and this poor guy. And but that
Yeah,
was
that being
definitely
an interesting like character trope to like borrow, like use that as like the sort of motivation or inspiration for it, and then suddenly you have this kind of more like side character in the book who's just known for giving unsolicited advice all the time, like we've all met that
she was
person, right? Like you're describing this woman on this airplane, but like I've met her too,
right. Oh my gosh. I mean, she was a trip, because I mean, I was just thinking like if I was sitting next to her, I would be thinking, oh my goodness, is there anything else I could possibly be doing right now other than have her continuously give me advice about, oh, with the altitude, you need to drink lots of water and you need to, and, just a million pieces of advice. I was like, oh my gosh, the poor guy. I think he ran in the other direction when he got off the plane. I don't know. I probably would have, so that and then she proceeded, when we got to the baggage claim area, there was an older gentleman on the plane who was in a wheelchair, and she wasn't with him at all, but she was all of a sudden like engaging him in conversation and asking him a million questions. And he finally was like, well, my wife is coming to pick me up. And I'm thinking, wow, this lady is like on a, going from like the college student to this intense geriatric. Like, I mean, she was asking him like so many questions about what color his suitcase was and where had he been and where had he traveled from,
Yeah.
and he definitely was not a gentleman who looked like he wanted to be having a conversation with her. Do you know that? When I turned around, he was kind of like, poor guy, he was a captive audience in his wheelchair, but that
Yeah,
was,
but it's
I
interesting from
mean,
like a story writing perspective because if you showed, like, say you borrowed this character, right? And then you showed them being a little bit questionably flirty with this like younger college kid who's maybe, but then you show them also having this a similar kind of situation with like the opposite end of the spectrum. Maybe as the reader, then you can assume like, oh, she doesn't mean to be flirty. I mean, that's how she's coming off, but that's just who she is. Like you would understand that like there she didn't mean anything by it. That's just she's just very friendly.
I know it was too funny. It was too funny. Oh my gosh. But yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. I mean, there's so many places to get good character research. Reality TV is also another
Mhm.
good mind numbing experience, but also you get some interesting characterizations of people.
So I have a question though about like how you provide the reader a happy ending, but also make it like realistic and authentic. Or within the genre, is the happy ending meant to be like the reader wants it tied up in a bow, so you give it to them tied up in a bow, or it's a happy ending of this particular snapshot, and that gives the reader enough like peace about it. Because as we know, like real world relationships don't have singular happy endings, happily ever after.
Well, I think, I mean, the way I see it is sort of that sort of the happy for now is
Mhm.
another way to think about it, is like, you tie it up in a way where the reader can feel like there's hope and possibility. And sometimes, I mean, one of the strategies that some romance writers use, and I haven't decided if I'm going to do this or not yet because I haven't gotten to really to the whether or not I want to put an epilogue on, but an epilogue is a really common way for them to put, like 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later. In this book I just read for the book group that I went to, it was like 9 years later, and everybody was like, that was the most random length of time. Like 9 years later, like, okay, well, yeah, because then she's like 29, so it's more realistic that she'd be getting married. But like 9 years, really? Like they were like, that's a long time for an epilogue, like to all of a sudden jump that far ahead in time. And so yeah, everybody was kind of like, huh, that didn't really work. But the author already had one bestseller, so now she just jumped on the bandwagon that people would want to read her next one. So a little bit, I think, was what people were kind of feeling at the end of that, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely, like, I think about um the end of Book Lovers by Emily Henry, and it's a very like unexpected but heartwarming moment between the characters that brings them back together. And that's where you're just like, oh, okay, it's a feel good, like they're back together because they had a distance, and so just, I think, just bringing it in a way where everybody feels like the characters are together and everybody's good.
Sometimes like the happy ending, the two characters coming together and just making a commitment that they're going to give it a real try versus like success in any sort of like long-term marriage type dynamic.
Yeah, it's not always marriage. Like, I feel like, and I mean I've focused more on like the contemporary romance as the contemporary as the subgenre of romance with the books that I've been reading. So those are more like true to kind of our everyday life. And so I'm not as familiar with, say, you know, people who are writing in sort of the paranormal or
Mm.
other, you know, the more intense like erotica end of things, or
I think I know how those
uh,
happy endings end.
well, yeah, we know how those go,
Those are
but
pretty obvious.
but yeah, so I mean, I think it's very different depending upon the subgenre that people write in, but really I feel like with the contemporary, it's more true to kind of real life. And it's not always marriage. Like sometimes it is, and sometimes that's what comes in the epilogue, is like you'll
Mhm.
have the characters will come together, and then the epilogue will be like, you know, 6 months later and you're at the wedding of the characters.
Okay.
You know, but it definitely is all of that kind of feel good that comes together at the end, because some of the books actually, like, that I've read, I mean, they handle some tough topics sometimes and sort of take, I mean, there can be a lot of tension in the book where you're kind of like, oh gosh, there's a lot going on here for these characters, or they're having to navigate a lot. But that's where that promise of the happily ever after, or the happy for now, or the happy ending is like, okay, I can go through this angst and I can go through this drama, and because I know that it's going to work out.
Mhm.
So I mean, that, you know, that kind of thing of, and sometimes I've read some very terrible romance, or I've listened to some, I mean, I definitely have probably listened to more of them on Audible than anything, because of all the driving I do. But uh, like definitely, there have been some where I haven't wanted to keep listening, but then I'm kind of curious from a writer standpoint of like, well, how are they going to talk? Like, how is this going to work out? Like, what is the author doing here? Like, why is this an important detail? Or why is this here? Or why are the characters doing this? And so then, you know, I start listening with a different perspective on like, why is this
Mhm.
happening? Or, you know,
What are some of the like disappointing happy endings that you've experienced as a reader of that genre?
oh gosh, I don't know if I can think of like, I think the ones that just kind of where things aren't brought together at the end, and I can't think of like specific, trying to think of like a specific ones. I think the ones where they aren't good, I just like don't remember them because they like didn't leave me
Mhm.
like thinking about them anymore. Do you know? It's just like,
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
or where I didn't really care about the characters enough to really believe that it would end the way it did. You know, just kind of left me like, oh, okay, well, that wasn't that interesting.
Is that
Or the
because the
ones,
tension was never really that high, and so they didn't really have that much to overcome, or because the tension was so high that it's like there's no way they're getting past that?
kind of both. Like there definitely been some where it's like their fight is over something that, and you just think like, how could you come back from, like, how could you come back from
Mhm.
that? um or where there just is too much, like where the whole book is too much fluff and you're like, eh. I mean, there's one
Or then
author
the
and I
happy
can't,
ending's just lackluster because they didn't have to work for it.
yeah, like there's one author and I can't think of the name of the author, but like the books are, a couple of books that I listened to were purely like centered around phone conversations between the characters. So there are
Mhm.
these endless phone conversations, and then eventually they meet and it's like, and they like each other and you're like, eh, okay. Like
Ugh.
really?
This sounds like the
Like,
worst aspect of like online dating in this day and age.
I'm like, that
Just
didn't that,
endless talking and then you finally meet and great, you get along.
yeah, that it was those were ones where I was like, this is purely because I need something to keep me awake while I'm driving. Like, even if it's mind numbing and um but yeah, it's Actually,
So it sounds like
speaking
you
of,
definitely have to control your tension because then you don't want it too low, but you also don't want it too high.
yeah, I think the tension is actually probably the most challenge, one of the most challenging parts is making sure that you keep it long enough, but that you keep it believable so that the readers don't like lose, like, because there's so much in romance that's about momentum too. It's like you've got to keep the momentum going because it's so, it has such a specific pattern and readers are expecting that pattern. Like they're expecting the that the characters in the beginning are going to come together in some way, and they know it's not going to happen right away, but somehow they have to come together, and then you have to work through how they eventually end up together. And that's actually what I was struggling with in my book was like, okay, I want to have my main character have this boyfriend that she's moving for,
Mhm.
but she also needs to meet the guy that she's going to ultimately fall in love with somewhere in the beginning of the book. So
Mhm.
I finally figured that out the other day, and it's going to be it's going to be an airplane. It's going to involve an airport and an airplane and meeting and stuff. Like on the flight from New York to Colorado, she will have had some sort of crash encounter with him,
Mm.
and I'm still figuring it out. Like still kind of
They're meet
figuring.
cute, right?
Yes,
Isn't that
it's
what it's
it.
called?
Yeah, it's the meet cute. So, um, and basically like he's going to really annoy her, and
As
she's going
all true loves do. Oh my God.
to so you know but it's like, but ultimately she's going to then like have him like, she's going to keep running into him, of course, in the small town as things, and as things get woven together. But yeah, but speaking of books, that it's not really in the romance genre, but it could be characterized as a romance. I just finished listening to Lessons in Chemistry. Have
Mm.
you seen that book?
No.
So it's a book that it's been on the like, I don't know, women's fiction, or and it's kind of been categorized as romance. Um, but it's set in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and the main character is a woman who she just has this strong personality and just pushes back, and she's a chemist during that
Mm.
time. And so it's this whole thing about being a chemist and having like the greatest love of her life who she never marries, but they have a child together. and and it's just this, it's really well done. It definitely deals with a lot of tough issue. Like, I mean, there's
That's the one they made
sex.
a TV show out of, right?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
because what happens is that she has to figure out how to support herself and her daughter, because the guy that she's in love with, he ends up dying, and
Mm.
they never marry. And so there's of course but there are issues, it deals with issues of sexual assault and having a child out of wedlock and all
Mhm.
of these things. But it's just one of those books where um you're like getting really mad, like, but it's also like it has kind of a happy, like it does kind of have a happy, like ever after sort of, it has that kind of similar thing in the end. But it was very well done. I mean, she clearly did her research. There's And the whole thing is that the main character gets hired to do a cooking show, but she does it all about chemistry. Like she teaches
Mm.
chemistry to women who are watching it. And so she's teaching the chemistry of cooking. And so her whole premise is that she wants to inspire these women to believe in themselves as more than just housewives and I mean, it's like you just love the, like by the end you just love the main character. Um
Mhm.
and you're just like yeah, it was very well done. Like it's definitely worth reading. Like I would read it again just because I'd love there are just some things in there to go back to highlight like, but I mean I listened to it on Audible, but yeah,
Mm.
it was definitely a good one. Like I was
With the
pleasantly
way you
surprised.
describe her, I'm imagining like a Bones merged with a Julia Child.
Yeah, kind of. It's kind of like, and she like won't smile, you know, she's like very intense about the fact that,
Mhm.
and it's awesome. And like, I mean, and like for you, like for yourself, like being a scientist, like you probably really appreciate how she just holds on to that identity throughout the whole book, where like when people say anything, she's like, but I'm a chemist. Like, do not question like anything else that I do because I, you know, and then like, yeah, it's definitely definitely a good one. Like for like kind of romancy, but also like, you know, social commentary. And interestingly enough, like unfortunately, I mean, there aren't that many things that have changed from that time in history. I mean, and so and you probably would have better like knowledge of that having been in a science focused career more. I mean, then you would probably understand the dynamic even more. Like I'm aware of it, but I'm sure that probably there are aspects of your memoir that have stories that are exactly stories that she tells about how she's treated by the men in the science like
Yeah.
yeah.
What's interesting about the forensic science field is it is actually like predominantly women.
Interesting.
However, what I experienced, and maybe this will shift with time, but an disproportionate percentage of our leadership, our managers, our bosses, all of that were men, considering that they made up maybe 20% of the total demographic. Like it was pretty probably like 80% female, 20%, you know, male. But then most of my bosses throughout my career were men, despite the
That's
fact that there weren't that many men in the field.
wow, that's interesting. That's
Mhm.
fascinating. Like
I've thought about, I don't include, you know, too much of like the day to day of my work in the memoir, just because it doesn't have much to do with loneliness and connection. And so I only have like certain stories that happen to take place while I was, you know, within my
yeah,
career. But I have toyed with the idea of writing about it in a fictionalized way, um, to sort of show what that world is like in a factual way, but then with some like fictional characters and stories and cases and whatnot.
that would be fascinating. I mean, to kind of
Plus,
play
that no one
around.
can come after me for it if
Well,
I say
but
it's
that would be,
fiction.
I mean, that might be kind of, I mean, that might be kind of fun in your own way of kind of a way to sort of like share some of the stories, but I don't know, a whole new level to like a Sue Grafton like
Yeah.
mystery, you know,
Yeah.
thing of, you know, the lead forensic scientist in a lab and like all the things that happen and
Yeah, I almost feel like it's like the grounds for like The Office, except it's the lab, you know, like just the day-to-day business of it. Like all the cases would be just like background noise because that's how it really was, you know, like because you just work one case after another, cranking out, meeting those quotas. Like
yeah.
I, every now and again, a case really mattered and was getting media attention and, you know, would become the focus. But really, the focus was all the like politics within the lab and whatnot, you know?
Your own NCIS kind of
Yeah, for sure.
that that yeah, that would be kind of, I mean that might be a nice brain break for you after like
Oh, it sounds like more
going
trauma to me.
oh no, maybe not.
I
But
don't know,
maybe it's,
maybe if it was fictionalized enough where I could have fun with it, but like, I don't know, some of it might feel a little too real.
but if you fictionalize it enough, at least you'd have some juicy characters. Like you know, you could really make something, but then maybe you don't want the attention from former colleagues that
Oh, well, the worst of them are already going in the memoir.
well, there you go. You've already handled them there. Anything else is just water
Yeah,
under the bridge. You're like, oh, that's
right.
easy.
Right.
All right. Well, I should go. I need to get back to my cleaning projects around here, but this was so fun. And
This
now
is
we
so
have
fun and
even
so
more.
productive. We have so much content. Like there were so many good